Hi, everyone, and welcome to this episode on the Business Edge podcast channel. This episode is a discussion about the President Biden's proposed infrastructure plan. I am Phil Matee. I'm the Director of Marketing here at the Feliciano School of Business. I'm here with Dr. David Axelrod from the Department of Economics at the Feliciano School of Business, and we'll be discussing this proposal. So welcome. Good morning, Dr. Axelrod.
Good morning, and thank you for having me again.
And for those of you who are listening, today is April 29th, and there's a lot going on. This is the morning after President Biden's first State of the Union speech, which Dr. Axelrod will touch upon as we discuss the infrastructure plan, because there's a lot of proposals that have been discussed. But for the sake of this discussion, we're going to really focus on this infrastructure plan. So let us begin. What are the components of the proposed Biden infrastructure plan?
Okay. So there's going to be about $600 billion towards transportation infrastructure, which would include some new and some repair to bridges, roads, public transit, ports, airports, and electrical vehicle development. Another $300 billion would go to improving drinking water infrastructure, expanding broadband capacity, and upgrading electric grids. Another $300 billion would go to building and retrofitting affordable housing, as well as constructing and upgrading schools. Another almost $600 billion would go to invest in manufacturing, research and development, and job training. It would also include about $400 billion to care for elderly and disabled Americans. So the plan envisions this spending over 8 years, right? So it's not going to be this next year, it's over 8 years. So it will average between $200 and $300 billion a year. Essentially, the US has acted like a homeowner that has put off repairs because they seemed expensive. Unfortunately, delays tend to compound cost over time. For example, a small leak in a roof, when not fixed immediately, becomes a bigger leak, which can lead to a mold problem. It can get into the electrical system and eventually make a house uninhabitable. So it's no surprise that we've got to put money into infrastructure. The fact that it's so much now is because we've been delaying it.
Yeah, what's interesting about infrastructure, and it's pretty unique, that's one idea that Republicans and Democrats actually agree upon. They all agree that we need to upgrade our infrastructure. During former President Trump's tenure, he also discussed it, and as well as the Republicans supported it, the Democrats supported. So it's actually an issue that both parties both agree upon, which is amazing in Washington, D.C., where you can have both parties agree on anything. And in this case, they agree upon infrastructure. So it's something that, and we as Americans, as you mentioned, we're seeing it in airports, bridges, tunnels, roads. I mean, I back out of my driveway every morning into a pothole. So I see it every morning also. So Americans, the Democrats, the Republicans, we're all agreeing on the fact that we have to improve the infrastructure within this country, which is wonderful on the surface. But then, of course, then it comes into how is it going to get paid for and what's included in this plan. Now, you mentioned all the dollar amounts, which equal about 2 trillion, 2.3 trillion, whatever what's a trillion here, what's a trillion there, it's no big deal. Right? So, but the Republicans argue, and again, on board with infrastructure, but they're arguing that most of the components are not infrastructure. And you mentioned a few of those. That instead these are liberal initiatives, kind of a Trojan horse, and kind of packaging them into this quote unquote infrastructure plan, all these liberal progressive ideas that the Democrats wanted to push forward for years, and now they have an opportunity. So what do you say to that?
Well, there's certainly an element of truth there that the Republicans are pointing out. So, for example, the money to go care for elderly and disabled could reasonably be considered not infrastructure, right? Some of the investment components likewise. However, what is essentially infrastructure, or what is essential infrastructure, has changed over the years. For example, broadband internet access is not a luxury anymore, both due to how much people work online and to the extent to which financial transactions and legal/governmental applications have replaced phone and physical mail with website and email interfaces. So, given the change in the economy for longer term, full employment, we're moving towards a gig economy. That's well understood. So, again, things like the broadband is become essential infrastructure. And, also in terms of systems for job training, different ways of investing, right? So if we're going to be more dependent on, for example, blockchain technology, right? It's a wonderful technology, but it's going to be very energy intensive. It's going to require a lot of servers. And if that is going to be our financial system, if we're going to be selling NFTs and stuff like that, that is now infrastructure. It's not luxury. And I think that's one of the challenges that we face. And I think and we can talk about it a little bit later, that part of the issue here isn't just money, it's also the change in culture that occurs over time.
Yeah, with Biden's plan, when I looked at it, when it first was released a few weeks ago, my first reaction was, why wouldn't Biden take the safe route and just have a plan with just pure infrastructure, roads, bridges, tunnels, airports, and which I think accounts for roughly 10% of the overall plan, roughly. And again, you probably can correct me on that. But why would he take the safe route and potentially get the Republicans on board? Because it'll be hard for the Republicans to argue that we have to fix our roads, bridges, and tunnels and airports. And then maybe have a second plan, which includes the components that you mentioned that are not pure infrastructure. Why do you think, in your opinion, why didn't he go that route?
That's a really good question. Obviously it's more political than economic. I think the Republicans have, in some sense, disempowered themselves in this situation, because if you're a Democrat, you probably don't have any faith that any kind of negotiation where you're including Republican concerns is going to lead you to have any more Republican votes. And so if that's the case, then, why bother to do something to appease Republicans if they're not even going to vote for it? If you're still going to end up with reconciliation and it's going to be a party line vote, then you should, from a Democrat standpoint, put everything in that you want. You're going to end up having a fight within your own party. But if that's the way you're going to go, then you satisfy everyone in your party so that you've got your 50+1 votes. Then you go to the Republicans and say, okay, here's the deal. We've got this. We don't need your help for anything else. But, we'll hear your ideas because we realize you've got a different perspective. Maybe you've got a better idea. And that's what Biden was specifically saying. But I think that's the political issue, is basically they're coming to say that.
And that's why elections matter. When you think of, if the Democrats had lost that one seat in Georgia, which I think was called in 2020, kind of last seat, that runoff, I think it was. Yep. Georgia and I think South Carolina, were those the two states, I think there were two states that were, but those two seats went Democrat. Now, if they had lost one of those, it would have been 51 Republican, 49 Democrat. And you and I would be having a different conversation, and the president would have had a different proposal, because he would have put forth a proposal that was less ambitious and probably more traditional infrastructure. And absolutely. And those elections were decided upon by 10, 20,000 votes. I mean, it wasn't a huge number. So again, that's a a little plug for anyone listening to remember to vote, because elections do matter.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I hear that a lot from people saying my vote doesn't matter. I'm like, yeah, it does. And you can go back to, was it 2004? No, sorry, 2000, Bush versus Gore, an infamous Florida election, where it was only decided upon by a handful of votes, and Bush became president. You know, the
Yeah.
infamous Chad, you know,
Oh,
they
yeah.
counted the Chads and the dimples, that whole thing. And then Florida was decided by a handful of votes.
And to go along with that, the new apportionment based on the census, you know, I mean, I heard a report that New York lost one seat, but if their census had another, I think it was 89 people, they wouldn't have lost that seat.
Yeah.
So I mean, so that's an example there that, you know, incredibly small fraction of people that maybe didn't bother to send in their census information may have lost a seat for New York.
Yeah. Yeah, we're veering off into a political discussion, David. So let's get
Unfortunately,
back to
it's tough. And unfortunately, economics is not completely separable from politics and vice versa.
You mean politics is involved in everything? Is that what you're saying?
Actually, this is what I tell a lot of people. It's this: everything is political. It's just that not everything is only political.
Good way to phrase it. Good way to frame it. So let's talk about and this is where the Republicans and Democrats disagree upon, you know, they agree upon infrastructure, disagree on how is it going to be paid. So Biden proposes tax increases on corporations and wealthy Americans. So what are those increases, and how will that affect? Because when we hear about tax increases, we as Americans start panicking because nobody wants to pay more taxes other than Warren Buffett, but we panic. So tell us about those taxes.
Okay. So part of his plan increases the corporate tax rate to 28%. It's currently at 21% since Trump's plan was passed. Before then, it was at 35%. So Biden is not even suggesting bringing it back to where it was before Trump. It's only going halfway. He's also proposing an alternative minimum tax of 15% on corporations with over $100 million in book income. So that's going to be a difference, right? I think one of the things he wants to make sure is successful corporations still pay taxes. You know, they can't get around having all the loopholes and everything. He's also encouraging a global minimum corporate tax rate, which would decrease incentives for U.S. businesses to offshore the tax havens like the Cayman Islands. Now, he doesn't have any authority to make that happen, but he's certainly encouraging it. As far as individual tax rates, he wants to see the top rate go back up to 39.6. It's currently at 37. And he's also suggesting a surtax on individuals earning above 400,000. He was very specific in his speech that he does not want to increase taxes on households with earnings below 400,000. Another important element is a reduction in the estate tax exemption from about 11 million to about 5.5 million, so like a 50% drop. So the implication is that when parents die and want to bequeath wealth to their children, the tax rate will kick in at lower levels of wealth. So this is going to impact about 1.5% of households. It's a small amount, but it's a not inconsequential amount. Okay. On the flip side, there would be increases in tax credits for child and dependent care, some tax relief for debt forgiveness, because technically a forgiven debt is considered income. So debt forgiveness is an issue there, as well as restoring first-time homebuyers credit. Now, it's often contended that increasing business taxes leads to a reduction of aggregate supply, lower GDP, and higher unemployment. Well, while there is truth in this, especially if a country raises taxes unilaterally, and that's the big concern, is the US raising taxes and while the other countries aren't. And so that would put it at a competitive disadvantage. It is also true that when taxes increase, it makes for a reduction in the net cost of business investment. So it can actually incentivize more investment in the short term, which would thereby increase aggregate expenditures, especially if businesses believe the taxes will be lowered again in the future, right? So, one of the dynamic, if you're a business and you're making long-term plans right now is, okay, under Biden, there's going to be higher taxes. The question is, when Republicans come into power again next, are they going to reduce taxes? Well, oddly, the cycling between lower and higher tax rates that occurred between Democratic and Republican administrations creates an amplification of a sower and reaper process, patterns which can increase investment over the long run. So for example, in the 1950s, we had very high tax rates. What that meant is that if you were thinking of investing, which means that you're going to buy things up front, it lowers the net cost of it because now you get to deduct that. And so you pay a whole lot less in taxes because of that. So if we increase the taxes now with an anticipation that at some point it'll be lower in the future, it actually could reinforce business investment now, right? In other words, they pay less on the cost up front and they'll get more of a benefit when they get the revenue in the future. So it's not as simple as, oh, it's higher taxes and higher taxes always.
The argument the Republicans made, and Tim Scott and his speech after President Biden's State of the Union discussed socialism, saying this is a socialist approach to handling the economy. You're raising taxes on the rich, raising on the corporation, you're redistribution of wealth. And of course, that word socialism scares Americans because we're a capitalist country. And of course, we're not going to become a socialist country anytime soon. But using that word scares people. So for those who believe this is a socialist approach to handling the economy by raising taxes and capital gains and raising tax on corporations, and now your redistribution of wealth, what do you say to that? Do you agree or disagree with that?
Well, first of all, it's been a while since we've been a quote unquote truly free market, laissez-faire capitalist system. One of the things that happened during the Great Depression and why FDR did what he did with the New Deal was that it was evidence that, yes, if you let the market do its thing, it will go to its equilibrium. All of that is still true. It's just that what that equilibrium is may or may not sustain a country. There is no promise that where you end up in the free market is enough to sustain society, especially if there is concentration of wealth. To a certain extent, yes, there is a socialist element to it. There's no way around it. On the other hand, you have to decide whether or not sustaining society is important. If it's a priority, you're going to end up with solutions that will seem more socialist. Now, to the extent that the government does a mixed approach, which is the government, pays for a lot of these things, but it's still private companies that do the production, that provide the services, that do the hiring. It's still more of a free market capitalist approach. If you're really going to get into socialism, it would be the idea that the government is the one that's providing the service and hiring people. So like, the National Health Service in the UK, for example. I'd say the Republicans have a germ of truth to be concerned about. But the reality is that since the 1930s, America's abundance and wealth and everything has been dependent on a large public sector. And it's more a question of, do you really want to go back to an economy where the government, was less than 1% of expenditures? I think any business worth its salt would say, oh, no, you don't want to go back to there.
Yeah. So, for the Americans, that it will not impact. For those making less than 400,000, for those who won't have an impact on capital gains or estate tax, I think most Americans will support this. But the one question I hear in my own circle of friends and family is, why now? We're coming out of a pandemic. Hopefully we're going to be farther along as we progress here. Unemployment is still high. It's gone down. I mean, jobs are coming back. Businesses are opening. But why now? Why would you tax companies and businesses now? Why would you wait a year? Let us get back on our feet. Let the unemployment rate come down to where we were pre-pandemic. Is the timing just not right?
Well, that is a good question. Now, if we refer back to what we were just talking about, the time if you're going to increase taxes and you want to have the least amount of pain, the time you would do that would be when businesses' incomes would be low or negative. So here's the thing. First of all, those businesses that weren't able to survive the short run they're gone, right? So the ones that are left are the ones that had enough resources to get through this last year. The issue that's really at hand here is whether or not private sector is going to invest, okay, to expand the capacity of production, because unless they're expanding capacity of production, they're not really expecting to produce more. If not expecting to produce more, they're not really going to hire more. So if what it looks like is trying to encourage them to expand production and to invest now, in many ways, a higher tax rate now makes it, like I was saying before, the net cost of investing lower, which would actually encourage more investment, with the caveat that they're anticipating that at some point the tax rate will be lower in the future.
So here's a question that's related to this topic. I always hear, and President Biden said this in his speech last night, you mentioned this as well, companies not paying tax, like Amazon, they paid zero tax. How's that possible? How do companies pay zero tax? It just doesn't make sense to us. I just don't know how they do this.
Yeah, well, there are certain loopholes. There are certain deductions, tax credits, and such that corporations, because they have the legal and tax expertise that we don't, can really get into the weeds to be able to take advantage of that. Part of it can be with what's called loss carryover from years when they made losses. Part of it also depends on how much of the income is accrued overseas. These are the specifics in how that is possible. Which is why Biden's proposal for an alternative minimum certainly would make sense. By the way, another thing with an alternative minimum is that if a company knows that it's going to spend a certain amount on taxes, no matter what, then that starts looking like a fixed cost, which has less than an impact on decision making in the short run.
Yeah, what's the other discussion which I have, and I did it, we can actually do a full podcast on this if we wanted to, but we have all these trillions of dollars. Like last year we had these stimulus plans, and this year we passed another stimulus plan, and the government, U.S. government, is essentially just printing money. And it sounds great, 2 trillion, 3 trillion, 500 billion, but ultimately this just adds to our country's debt. In 20 seconds, what impact does that have to the average American, all these trillions of dollars? How does that impact us long term? What are the implications of it? Because if that were the case, we could just keep printing money and keep giving out money. Assuming there's no revenue coming in, what impact does that have to the average American?
Okay. So in terms of the long run, if we were to keep this up indefinitely, one, it supports a larger economy, especially if we've got to make big changes. Two, it's likely to cause higher inflation. As far as the passing on of debt, I think the analogy is this: if you own $1 million home and you refuse to pay for repairs for 30 years, yeah, you save the money up front. You're not passing on debt to your child, but that $1 million home will have been dilapidated, and it's not worth $1 million to them. So the question is, how valuable of a United States, right, and world do you want to pass on to your children? Okay, so that's the thing. Do you want to pass that on? And if you do, well, what are you willing to pay now for that?
Well said. All right, let's get back to the infrastructure plan. The Republicans propose a smaller plan. What are those components and how are they different than Biden's plan?
Okay, so the Republican plan is a little under 600 billion. So, about a third of the size, maybe a little smaller. So about half would go for bridges and roads, roughly another 60 billion for public transit, another 20 billion for rail, about another 35 billion for water treatment. And by the way, water treatment is such a big issue. I mean, just remember what happened in Michigan.
Yep.
Another 13 billion for safety, 17 billion for ports, another 44 billion for airports, and maybe another 65 billion for broadband. So it's a smaller packages and focuses on traditional concepts of infrastructure. So, that leaves out the money for elderly and disabled and some of the investments. Again, this is, again, what we were saying before. Republicans want to focus on a traditional concept of infrastructure. And that's what they can get behind because they know it's a problem. It really is a problem. I think part of their issue is they don't want government spending more than it absolutely has to.
Yeah, the other piece to this, and we talked about politics, is what I believe why Biden's pushing for this plan as well as some other plans is the idea that potentially the Democrats can lose the House during the midterms of 2022. They lost some seats in the House in 2020, even though they won the presidency and picked up seats in the Senate. And plus with some redistricting, sorry,
Yeah.
It's a hard word to say. As you mentioned, the Democratic states lost some House seats. So, he knows he has a window here to get his agenda forward. Probably, 18 months that he could do this. And potentially after 2022, if the Republicans pick up the House, what I believe what the Republicans would do to Biden is what they did to President Obama for 6 years. They're just going to shut everything down and not allow any bills to go forward. So there's a short window, and then the uncertainty of Biden's running for re-election. And let's say if the Democrats keep the House, will he run for re-election in 2024 due to his age and maybe the party? But again, we don't know that. He's saying he's going to run for re-election, but he may not. So there's a lot of uncertainty, but what they do know right now is they have this short window of time that they could potentially get these bills forward. And this is not uncommon. Every president before Biden has done this. Trump did it for his first 2 years, pushing through his plan. President Obama did it. President Bush did it. So this is nothing out of the ordinary.
Nothing new.
Every president does this. And typically every president loses control of a Senate or the House within the first midterm. Happened to Trump, happened to Obama, happened to Bush. So again, when people say, why is he jamming this through? Every president has done this. So this is nothing abnormal here. So again, I think there's that piece of this, that I think the urgency of getting this through. So let's talk about what impact do you think the infrastructure plan, if it is passed the way it is written now, and I think it's not going to pass exactly the way it's written, and I think, and Biden knows that. So, and I think you mentioned this when we had our pre-interview, he asked for everything, knowing you're not going to get everything. They'll negotiate the Republicans, or go down the path of budget, reconciliation, to avoid getting the 60 votes in the Senate, which he'll never get, because the Republicans, you're not going to get Republicans to vote for this, the plan the way it is. And he may even not get a couple Democrats may not vote for it, some of the more moderate leaning Democrats. So, so I think it's going to change. But regardless, let's assume that it's similar to what he's proposing. What impact do you think it will have on the economy?
Okay, well, working off Biden's speech last night, right? He expanded on the human and long-term aspects of his proposals. So the plan will certainly be the case that the increased spending will grow the economy, increase employment, and make the U.S. more competitive in a world that is moving on with or without us, right? That's one of the things we can't forget. America does not live in isolation as much as maybe we'd like to think so. We are quickly becoming only a small part of a bigger global world. And, China is really peer-like in terms of, influence and power in the world. Okay. However, it is not without its risks, right? If the economy overheats, inflation could spike up, and the response will be to increase interest rates. If that happens, that will dampen some of the expansion of consumer demand and lead to some crowding out of private investment. That's always a concern, right? On the other hand, the sheer amount that corporations are holding on it in cash now, which it's phenomenal how much cash they're holding on to. That indicates that they have become a reduced source of investing in the U.S. already. So part of Biden's infrastructure plan is building off the fact that businesses, the private sector, is not investing in the way that we would hope. And that gets back to the issue of, what is the market equilibrium? And if the market equilibrium is not investing in the future, or in not a big way, then how else are you going to invest in the future? So improvements in infrastructure should make private investment a better bet, by the way. Right. So the idea is you prime the pump by making some of the investments by the government today in basic infrastructure. It makes investing in the United States look more profitable, because if it's going to be less costly for transportation, transactions, all those kind of things, then private sector will go, oh, you know what? Yeah, we can invest in the US now. Okay. Now, while we often focus on the size of the economy, things like the unemployment rate, inflation, and other statistics, another impact on the economy is a movement in a different direction, right? So the economy includes the set of institutions and mechanisms for producing a society's staples and cultures. So the US is facing the pressures of letting go of a 20th century culture reliant on fossil fuels and plastics and disposable waste. This will be more difficult for those of greater age, both people and businesses, that have adapted their lives and success to that culture. So the challenge is not just financial, as in, who's going to pay for all this stuff. It is psychological, spiritual, and cultural as well. And it's that latter part, I think, that people are fighting back against even more. I mean, they're very specific about it. It's like, this is not the America that we used to know. Now, I mean, there's elements of racial issues, but it really is about, no, it's not going to be the way it was in the middle of the 20th century. It can't be. We don't have the same kind of resources. We're not going to have cheap oil, right? We can't just, keep polluting the way that we have. That things are going to have to be different going forward. And that's the disruption.
Yeah, and it gets to a point where what's disheartening is getting to a place where Republicans and Democrats can work together. Will there ever come a time, this is obviously a political question, will there ever come a time, because you mentioned this earlier, how businesses, if this plan goes through, he's raising taxes, and then businesses will think, well, if a Republican comes in, they'll lower the taxes. And so we're kind of in this cycle where whoever is the president, whoever controls the House and Senate, they'll decide the direction of this country. There's no sense of anyone working together anymore, even now or in the near future. And that's where I was hoping, and I know the Republicans are obstinate. I know they're defiant and they're not going to want to work with Biden. What I'm hoping to see here is some level of bipartisanship where Biden reaches across the aisle and works with the other part, with the Republican Party, as hard as it is, because we somehow have to break the cycle. Because whether Biden wins re-election or not, whoever becomes president, in essence, the president then becomes kind of like a dictator in a way, where if he or she has the party and they control the House and Senate, and then you have this budget reconciliation process where you don't even need a full 60 votes in the Senate. It's scary and it's sad to think that we have this form of government where there's no sense of bipartisanship. It's what Trump did 4 years ago, right? He came in, he had his House and Senate for 2 years, pushed things through. And now with Biden, it's going the same route. I mean, the stimulus plan had no Republican votes. Now we're going to the infrastructure plan. And if he goes down the reconciliation process, and if he doesn't negotiate with Republicans, it's setting this precedent where we're just in this cycle of whoever's in power, whatever party's in power, that's what gets pushed through. And you go back to the 70s and the 80s, even the 90s, the Republicans and Democrats worked together. And they really were true bipartisan bills that were put forth. And when President Obama, and I think that's where it started, where McConnell, and he was public about it, he said, I want to make him a one-term president. And after President Obama, after 2 years, the House, I forgot what House, actually House and Senate went to Republican. For 6 years, everything shut down. Democrats did it to Trump as well. So they did it for the 2 years they were in power, the House and Senate. And now we're back to the Democrats controlling the presidency. It's like, I don't know, I'm not asking for an answer. It's just, it's at a point where I don't know what the solution is. But what I'm hoping now is with this plan and the plan that he discussed last night, some additional plans that he's proposing, there's some level of, and maybe the Republicans will never vote for anything he proposes, but if he can reach out, at least meet with them and talk to them, and hopefully that sets a precedent going forward for the Biden presidency and then subsequent presidencies of other presidents. So anyway, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, a couple of them. First of all, right, this has been part of the discussion of that, what democracy looked like series that MSU has been putting on, and, the one I was part of on economics and democracy earlier. There really is a, how am I going to put this? A sort of a battle between democracy and autocracy around the world. China, for example, is putting its bet on the fact that autocracy is going to have better results than democracy. Now, That's in terms of being able to be a powerful economy, get things done. Yeah, you're going to have a loss of personal freedoms. But to use a early 19th century perspective, you don't want your freedom to be the freedom of how to choose to die.
Yeah.
You want starvation? You want disease? We got your choice there.
What's autocracy? I'm sorry. I've never heard the word.
Autocracy basically means either a single individual or very, very small group making decisions for a whole political economic system. My take is that it's going to be sort of a balancing act. Ultimately, if you go full autocracy, you end up with a system that does a lot of micromanaging, and that will also fail because at the individual level, you need a lot of improv, right? It's one thing if at the big scope, you're talking about over the next 5 years, we want to get to here, we want to expand infrastructure, we want to expand healthcare. But if you're starting to tell the doctors and the business people what they have to do, little step by little step, you don't get the full advantage of optimizing with what's actually happening on the ground right now. So it is a balance of long-term planning and short-run improv. And so I think in the future, you're going to have a mix of a certain amount of autocracy, which people might refer to as socialism and communism, and capitalism. On the other hand, if you end up with monopolies, or very narrowed oligopolies in a market system, that is essentially an autocracy as well. So the real issue is that we're dealing with a complex world, and there are tremendous fixed costs to be able to be producers of certainly things like infrastructure, but also just to advertise and to be known in an economy. And whenever there are very large fixed costs, there are economies of scale, which means we tend to have larger organizations. So whether you have a privately owned monopoly or decide that you need regulations, if it's only owned by a very, very few people, then the question is, are you better off it being privately owned or publicly owned?
Yeah, as you were speaking, I was thinking about a class that I took 30 years ago at Montclair State. I took my one and only economics class, and I remember a professor, who I don't remember his name, had said the stock market never lies. So always look at the market every time an announcement happens. So I just looked at the market this morning, and the market's up by 20, 30 points. So this is a morning after Biden's speech. So obviously the market is responding to it favorably. The market didn't crash because that was a concern of what's going to happen to the stock market if this plan it passes, and it seems like the market feels good about what Biden's proposing because it will impact all these major organizations like the Googles and the Amazons who are going to be impacted by this. So that's good to see. So let's wrap up. So what do you think?
Phil,
go ahead.
Can I just add something to that just quickly?
Sure.
One of the things that, if we're looking at the market and such, is the difference between, growth from capital gains and growth from profit and dividends. If you look historically, in the 20th century, dividends would average about 5% of income, In the last 20 years or so, especially since the Great Recession, it's down to about 2%. So a lot of the growth in equities, the total return of equities, is coming from capital gains, and that, if it's associated with lower dividends, that means it's the fact that we've had easy money and low interest rates that are artificially inflating the prices of assets. So if they have a positive response to what Biden is suggesting, it's because it will actually change the balance to having more production, which means more profit, which means that you can cut back on easy money. Now, for those that are relying on capital gains, they're not happy about that. But if you're talking about, long run success in the economy, you're talking about actual production, not just, how much you can sell your share of an equity for.
Good point. So let's wrap up. So what do you think is going to happen here? You think Biden will get his plan as he's proposing? You think he'll negotiate the Republicans? Where do you think this is all going to end up with infrastructure?
Well, he will try to negotiate with the Republicans because, first of all, he's old school. I mean, literally old school.
Yeah.
And he actually has relationships with many of the older Republicans. So, I think for many of them, they would love to do something bipartisan. The challenge is that, if it comes across like they're negotiating and compromising with the Democrats, their concern is that you'll just get kicked out, because like, oh, you compromised with them. So he's gonna talk with them. He's gonna try to give them something to work with. So I would expect the plan to be tweaked downwards a little bit. But I don't think any of the Republicans are going to be able to assure them of a vote. And, then from his progressive plank, he can't afford to lose any of those. I'm sure Mnuchin and, not Mnuchin, Manchin.
I was like, wait, what?
Wrong name.
Wrong president.
Will tweak it down a drop as well, but not as much as the Republicans would like. So it'll be tweaked downward a little bit, but I would be surprised, if they're going to get any Republicans to vote on this, and they know that, and they're not going to stop it. I mean, Biden was very specific. Look, we can't do nothing, and either the Republicans can be on board and get more of a say and be bipartisan, or the Democrats will know that there's no point in negotiating with them, and they'll just go ahead and do what they want while they have the power.
David, thank you. I'm Phil Mattia, the marketing director of the Feliciano School of Business, and hopefully we'll talk soon.
Thank you for having me, and I look forward to it.